The morning of my birthday began like every other in our modest suburban home, with the faint smell of coffee wafting through the air, and the familiar creak of the stairs as Andrew descended with a cheerful happy birthday. His voice carried that same warm, steady tone I had fallen for all those years ago. Yet, as I sat there in my robe, nursing my cup of tea, there was a strange flicker of anticipation, or perhaps unease, that I couldn't quite place. He handed me a small, neatly wrapped box with an oversized bow. Andrew always excelled at presentation, his gifts as thoughtful as they were perfectly packaged. This time was no different. Inside, I found an elegant envelope embossed with gold lettering. A certificate for self-discovery courses at Horizon Center for Personal Growth. My initial reaction was confusion. I looked up, hoping for a clue, but his face was a mask of earnest enthusiasm. "You've been so stressed lately," he explained. "Between the kids, work, everything. I thought this might help you reconnect with yourself." His words felt genuine, and for a moment guilt pricked at me. Was I ungrateful for not immediately appreciating the gesture? I nodded, managing a smile, and thanked him. Deep down, though, something about the gift felt off. He had never mentioned this center before. And yet, here he was, speaking about it like he was certain it was exactly what I needed. The following weekend, I found myself driving to the Horizon Center, the certificate clutched in my hand like a lifeline. I had Googled it the night before. A sleek, minimalist building tucked away on the outskirts of the city, offering courses on mindfulness, emotional balance, and personal empowerment. Andrew had been unusually insistent that I start right away, and although I found his eagerness strange, I rationalized it as his way of showing support. The center itself was as serene as its website promised. Soft instrumental music played in the background, and the reception area smelled faintly of lavender. A polished woman in her 40s greeted me with a wide smile, handing me a clipboard to fill out my information. "Welcome, Emily. You're going to love it here," she said, her voice almost too soothing. I sat in the waiting area filling out forms when a familiar voice caught my ear. First, I thought I was imagining it. I turned, scanning the open space, and my stomach clenched. There she was. Sophie. I knew her instantly, even though we had only met once. A fleeting introduction at one of Andrew's office parties. She was his colleague, or so I had thought. Sophie was striking, with auburn hair and a confidence that made everyone else in the room seem dim by comparison. At the time, I had chalked up my unease to insecurity. Now seeing her here, something twisted inside me. "Emily," she said, her tone registering mild surprise before quickly shifting to professional warmth. "You're in my session today. Welcome." It took me a moment to respond. My mind raced as I forced a polite smile and nodded. Why was she here? Why hadn't Andrew mentioned her connection to this place? The session began with guided breathing exercises and icebreakers. Sophie led the group, her voice commanding yet nurturing. But I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling back to Andrew's insistence that I come here, the nagging feeling that this was all too coincidental. When the session ended, I waited until most of the group had dispersed before approaching her. "It's nice to see a familiar face," I began, testing the waters. "I didn't realize you worked here." She tilted her head, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Yes, I've been here for a while. It's such fulfilling work." "Did Andrew know you were here when he got me the certificate?" I asked, my tone light but probing. Her expression faltered for a split second, barely noticeable, but enough to confirm my growing suspicions. "Oh, I don't think so. He probably just wanted you to have some time for yourself." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but my chest tightened. There was something she wasn't telling me. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts a tangled web of questions and doubts. Andrew greeted me with his usual smile, asking how it went. I mumbled something vague and retreated upstairs, where I could finally let the unease consume me. That night, while Andrew slept soundly beside me, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through his phone. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Or perhaps dreading. Messages between him and Sophie, hidden under a false contact name. They weren't overtly explicit, but the context was unmistakable. Late-night meetings, inside jokes, and a level of familiarity that no colleague should have. My hands trembled as I scrolled, each message another dagger to the heart. The certificate wasn't a thoughtful gift. It was a distraction, a convenient way to get me out of the house so he could continue whatever it was they had without interference. The next morning I confronted him. I held nothing back, my voice trembling with rage and betrayal. At first, he denied it, spinning excuses that only fueled my anger. But when I showed him the messages, the color drained from his face. He stammered, tried to explain, but there was no justification for what he had done. "I thought the courses would help you," he said at one point, as if that somehow absolved him. "Help me? Or help you buy time?" I shot back, my voice cracking. The argument lasted hours, a storm of accusations and half-hearted apologies that left us both emotionally drained. By the end of it, one thing was clear. Our marriage was over. 2 weeks later, I returned to the Horizon Center, not for a session, but to hand Sophie something she had likely never received from one of her clients' wives. A copy of the divorce papers I had filed. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The look on her face was satisfaction enough. As I walked out of the center that day, I felt an unfamiliar lightness, a weight lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in Andrew's shadow, trying to be the wife he wanted me to be. I was just Emily, heartbroken but free. And that certificate, I burned it. Some journeys of self-discovery are better taken alone. In the weeks that followed, I navigated my life with the precision of someone clinging to control by her fingernails. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stranger's domain, every corner holding memories of a life that had unraveled in a single moment. Andrew moved into a small apartment across town, and our communication was reduced to clip discussions about logistics, bank accounts, splitting up furniture, and most painfully, the schedule for our 2 children. Despite everything, I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for their sake. Mornings were for school drop-offs and pretending I wasn't hollow inside, afternoons spent at work, where my colleagues gave me sympathetic but respectful space. Nights, though, were the hardest. The silence of the empty house pressed down on me like a weight, and I'd sit in the living room for hours, staring at the divorce papers I'd filed but hadn't yet finalized. Then came the emails. It started innocuously enough, Andrew asking if I needed help with the kids' extracurricular activities, or whether I'd decided what to do with the old dining table. But soon his messages turned personal. Apologies. Regrets. Lines like, "I never meant to hurt you," and "I was stupid and I've realized how much I lost." I deleted most of them without reply. He had made his choice, and I wasn't going to be his safety net while he figured out how much he'd screwed up. But one message stopped me cold. It read, "I ended it with Sophie. It was a mistake. She meant nothing to me compared to what we had." Rage bubbled up inside me as I read the words. Was he really trying to salvage his dignity by downplaying their relationship? The same relationship he had gone to such lengths to hide? I slammed my laptop shut and went for a walk, hoping the crisp autumn air would cool my fury. It didn't. As I walked past the rows of neatly kept suburban houses, I felt a pull, not toward Andrew but toward my own life, my own worth. I'd spent so many years orbiting his world, accommodating his needs, his ambitions, that I hadn't stopped to ask myself what I truly wanted. The divorce certificate wasn't just a legal document. It was an invitation to rediscover who I was. That night I made a list. It was simple, almost childlike, but it gave me something to hold on to. At the top, I wrote things I want to do for me. Underneath, I started jotting down everything I'd put off or abandoned during my marriage. Learn to paint.
Take a solo trip.
Join a book club. Finally run that half marathon I've been talking about for years. The next day, I signed up for a local painting class. It felt like a small step but a significant one. The first session was awkward, me surrounded by strangers, fumbling with brushes and trying to remember the last time I'd let myself create something. But as the weeks passed, I found a strange solace in the simple act of mixing colors and watching shapes emerge on the canvas. One evening after class, I was packing up my supplies when a man approached me. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "That's a great use of negative space," he said, nodding at my half-finished painting. I laughed nervously. Negative space feels appropriate these days. He introduced himself as Ben, a high school art teacher who had been attending the class to reconnect with his own creativity. Over the next few weeks, we struck up a tentative friendship, sharing coffee after class and talking about everything from art to life's unexpected turns. He was divorced too, and there was an unspoken understanding between us. No pressure, no expectations, just two people learning how to move forward. Meanwhile, Andrew continued his campaign of apologies. He called one evening while the kids were at their grandparents'. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity, and maybe a lingering flicker of something I didn't want to name, made me pick up. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I know I've said it before, but I need you to believe me. I screwed up, Emily. I was selfish and I took you for granted. I've been seeing a therapist trying to understand why I did what I did." His words stirred something in me, but it wasn't forgiveness. It was sadness. Sadness for the man I had loved, for the family we had built, and for the wreckage he had left behind. "I appreciate that you're trying to fix yourself," I said finally. "But this isn't something you can fix with words. Trust doesn't just grow back because you want it to." There was a long pause before he spoke again.
Emísio, Eminência.
"I miss us." After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. Part of me wanted to believe him, to cling to the idea that we could somehow piece our lives back together. But the other part, the stronger, wiser part, knew that what we had was gone. Andrew's betrayal had cracked something fundamental in our relationship, something that no amount of therapy or apologies could mend. Ben, meanwhile, was a quiet presence in my life, never pushing, always listening. One evening, as we walked along the river after class, he turned to me and said, "You seem lighter these days." I smiled, surprised by the observation. "I guess I'm learning how to breathe again." "Good," he said, his voice soft. "You deserve that." His words stayed with me. For so long I had defined myself by my roles: wife, mother, supporter of Andrew's dreams. Now, for the first time, I was allowing myself to just be Emily. Imperfect, uncertain, but whole in a way I hadn't been in years. The divorce papers were finalized 6 months after Andrew gave me that damn certificate. The day I signed them, I didn't cry. Instead, I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and painted until the early hours of the morning. The canvas was a riot of colors, bold and unapologetic. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The months after finalizing the divorce were a blur of contradictions. Some days felt light and full of possibility, like I'd finally stepped into a life where I could choose my own direction. Other days, the weight of loneliness pressed down on me, and I missed the familiarity of having someone to share even the smallest details of my day with. But as time moved forward, so did I. Slowly, I began to notice the space Andrew left wasn't so much a gaping wound anymore as it was a quiet, unoccupied corner of my life. The kids adjusted better than I had expected, though it wasn't without hiccups. At first, they were confused, angry even at the upheaval of our family dynamic. I tried to shield them from the worst of it, careful never to badmouth Andrew in front of them, but kids are perceptive. They knew things weren't right, and as much as I tried to present a united front with Andrew when it came to parenting, the fractures in our relationship were hard to hide. I focused on giving them stability, keeping our routines as intact as possible while navigating this new normal. Over time, they seemed to settle into the rhythm of our separate households, and while it wasn't perfect, it was manageable. I threw myself into painting, discovering that it was more than just a hobby. It was a lifeline. Each stroke of the brush was an outlet, a way to process emotions I couldn't put into words. I started painting almost every evening after the kids went to bed, losing myself in the swirl of colors and textures. What began as a personal escape turned into something more when my instructor suggested I submit one of my pieces to a local gallery's open call. At first, I laughed off the idea, convinced that my amateur efforts weren't worthy of public display. But with a little coaxing, I decided to take the leap. The night of the gallery opening was surreal. Walking into the small, warmly lit space, I felt both exhilarated and exposed. My painting, a bold, abstract piece inspired by the tumult of the past year, hung on the wall among works by far more experienced artists. I didn't expect anyone to notice it, but as I stood there nursing a glass of wine, a woman approached me. She introduced herself as the gallery owner and complimented my work, asking about the story behind it. For the first time, I found myself sharing parts of my journey, how I'd turned to painting as a way to heal and rebuild. She listened intently, and by the end of our conversation, she asked if I'd consider participating in a group exhibition she was planning for emerging artists. I left the gallery that night feeling something I hadn't felt in years: pride. Not the hollow pride of playing the perfect wife or mother, but a genuine sense of accomplishment, knowing that I had created something meaningful from the ashes of my old life. It was a turning point, a moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter. Meanwhile, my friendship with Ben continued to deepen. He remained a steady presence, never rushing or pressuring me, which was exactly what I needed. One evening, after one of our usual post-class coffee outings, he asked if I wanted to join him for a weekend hike. First, I hesitated. The idea of spending hours alone with him in the woods felt daunting, not because I didn't trust him, but because I wasn't sure I trusted myself. I was still rebuilding, still fragile in some ways, and the thought of letting someone get close scared me. But something in his easy smile and gentle demeanor made me say yes. The hike turned out to be exactly what I needed. A chance to unplug, to breathe fresh air, and to be in the moment without the noise of my inner doubts. We talked about everything and nothing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a connection that wasn't rooted in obligation or history, but in mutual respect and understanding. By the time we reached the summit, with the sun setting over the horizon, I realized that I was smiling. Not the forced, polite smile I'd perfected over years of pretending everything was fine, but a genuine expression of joy. That evening, as we sat on a rocky outcrop eating sandwiches and watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange, Ben turned to me. "You've come a long way," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. "You're stronger than you think." The words hit me harder than I expected. For so long I had felt like a shell of myself, defined by my mistakes, my pain, my losses. Hearing someone else acknowledge my growth, my resilience, felt like validation I didn't realize I needed. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. Our friendship shifted after that hike. It was subtle at first: longer conversations, more frequent outings, but there was an unspoken understanding between us that something deeper was developing. I was cautious, terrified even, of rushing into anything after Andrew. But with Ben there was no rush, no pressure. He gave me the space to move at my own pace, and for that I was grateful. By the time spring rolled around, life looked different. I was no longer just surviving, I was living. The gallery exhibition was a success, and I began selling a few of my paintings, which felt like a small but significant victory. The kids seemed happier too, adjusting well to the co-parenting arrangement. Even my interactions with Andrew had settled into a civil, almost cordial rhythm. He had stopped trying to win me back and had instead shifted his focus to being a better father, which I appreciated more than I could express. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the kids play in the yard, Ben arrived with a bottle of wine and a bouquet of wildflowers. It wasn't the grand, dramatic gesture of a romantic movie, but something simpler, more thoughtful, exactly what I needed. We sat together, talking and laughing as the sun dipped below the horizon, and for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future with him. Not because I needed someone to fill the void Andrew had left, but because Ben felt like someone who saw me for who I truly was. Not just a mother, not just a woman recovering from heartbreak, but Emily. And that, I realized, was more than enough. As the months turned into a year since Andrew and I had officially parted ways, my life began to take on a rhythm that felt distinctly my own. I no longer flinched when I saw his name on my phone, or felt a pang of longing when I passed places we used to frequent together. The edges of the pain had dulled, softened by time and by the life I was rebuilding piece by piece. My evenings were no longer dominated by overthinking and sleepless nights. Instead, they were filled with painting, reading, or simply sitting with a glass of wine, savoring the quiet without feeling alone. The silence no longer haunted me. It nourished me. Ben continued to be a steady presence in my life, and while we never had a formal conversation about us, our relationship grew in its own quiet, organic way. He was patient, never asking for more than I was ready to give, and in return, I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't thought possible. He didn't fill the void Andrew had left. He created a new space entirely, one that was safe and comforting without feeling overwhelming. With Ben there was no rush, no pressure to be anything other than myself, and for that I was grateful. One evening we went to a small community event in town, a spring festival that the kids had been begging me to attend. It was one of those idyllic scenes that looked like it belonged on a postcard. String lights hung between trees, local vendors sold everything from handmade crafts to fresh-baked goods, and the sound of a live acoustic band floated through the air. The kids ran off to explore, their laughter echoing as they darted between the booths. I stood with Ben, a warm breeze brushing against my skin as we shared a plate of fried dough, powdered sugar sticking to our fingers. "You've got something right there," Ben said, motioning to my cheek with a small smile. I laughed, wiping at my face, only for him to shake his head and step closer. Gently, he brushed the powdered sugar off with his thumb, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. My heart fluttered in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. For a second, I wondered if anyone around us could see what was happening, if they could sense the quiet shift between us. But the world seemed to fade, leaving only the two of us standing there under the glow of the lights. It wasn't long after that evening that Ben asked me if I'd like to take a weekend trip with him. He'd found a cozy cabin a few hours away, nestled in the woods near a serene lake. The idea of getting away, of leaving behind the weight of my responsibilities even for just a couple of days, was tempting. But at the same time I hesitated. It felt like a step into something more serious, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for that yet. "I don't want you to feel pressured," Ben said when I expressed my uncertainty. "This isn't about rushing things. I just thought it might be nice to spend some time together, away from everything." His understanding made the decision easier. A week later, we packed up his car and drove to the cabin, the journey filled with easy conversation and the kind of comfortable silence that didn't need filling. When we arrived, I was struck by how peaceful it was. The cabin was small but charming, with large windows that overlooked the lake and a stone fireplace that practically begged to be lit. The weekend was perfect in its simplicity. We hiked trails that wound through the forest, sat by the lake skipping stones, and cooked meals together in the tiny kitchen. In the evenings, we curled up by the fire, talking about everything from childhood memories to the lives we'd both envisioned for ourselves before they took unexpected turns. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself relax completely. I wasn't Emily the ex-wife or Emily the mother. I was just Emily, and that was enough. On the last night of the trip, as we sat on the porch watching the moonlight ripple across the lake, Ben reached for my hand. His touch was gentle, his thumb tracing small circles against my skin. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I didn't expect to feel this way, not after everything I've been through. But being with you, it's different. You make me want to try again." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I felt the familiar tug of fear, the instinct to protect myself from the possibility of more heartbreak. But beneath that fear was something stronger. A quiet, persistent hope that maybe, just maybe, I could trust someone again. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I want to try too." Ben smiled, his relief palpable. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a dramatic revelation or a grand gesture, but a quiet acceptance that it was okay to take a chance. It was okay to let someone in. When we returned from the trip, life resumed its usual pace, but everything felt just a little brighter. The kids took to Ben in a way that surprised even me, their laughter and ease around him a testament to his kindness and patience. My relationship with Andrew also settled into a better rhythm. Not friendship, exactly, but a cooperative partnership that made co-parenting smoother. He still carried the weight of regret, and while I didn't forgive him in the way he might have hoped, I let go of the anger that had once consumed me. It wasn't for his sake, but for mine. Holding on to resentment only kept me tethered to the past, and I was ready to move forward. Months turned into seasons, and my life continued to evolve. I started showing more of my paintings at local galleries, even selling a few pieces to collectors who saw something in my work that resonated with them. Each sale felt like a validation of the journey I'd been on, proof that beauty could come from even the most painful experiences. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I stood in my small studio adding the final touches to a new painting, Ben walked in holding a cup of coffee and a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me with a sheepish grin. "What's this?" I asked, unfolding the paper. "It's a list," he said. "Your list, actually. The one you told me about, the things you wanted to do for yourself. I might have added a couple of suggestions at the bottom." I scanned the paper, my heart swelling as I recognized the familiar bullet points. Learn to paint.
Teca solo trip.
Join a book club. Run a half marathon. And at the bottom, written in Ben's neat handwriting, 2 new items. Spend a weekend in Paris. Dance under the stars. I looked up at him, tears brimming in my eyes. Paris, huh? That's ambitious. He shrugged, his grin widening. I thought it might make a good adventure. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, dreaming, and daring to believe in happiness again. Whatever came next, I was ready. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself returning to that list more often than I expected. Not as a set of unattainable goals, but as a reminder of how far I'd come. Each item checked off represented a step forward, a victory in the quiet battle I'd waged to reclaim myself from the wreckage of my past. I didn't rush to finish the list. There was no deadline, no pressure. But knowing it existed gave me a sense of purpose, a quiet thrill of anticipation for what might come next. Ben became an integral part of my life, not by filling a void but by creating something new, something entirely his own. The kids adored him, and their connection with him felt natural and unforced. He had a way of making them laugh that I hadn't seen in a long time, the kind of belly laughs that reminded me they were healing too, in their own way. It was one thing to rebuild myself, but watching my children find their footing in this new reality was a different kind of joy, one that filled me with gratitude. One Saturday morning, Ben suggested we tackle one of the items on my list, the half marathon. I had almost forgotten I'd written it down, assuming it would stay one of those far-off dreams, something I'd never quite muster the courage or endurance to achieve. But Ben had other ideas. He showed up at my door with running shoes in hand and a confident grin, declaring, "Today's the day we start training." I groaned, protesting that I wasn't ready, that I wasn't a runner, that I'd embarrass myself. He didn't let me wallow in excuses. Instead, he handed me a water bottle, laced up my shoes, and led me out the door. The first run was brutal. My legs burned, my chest heaved, and I was convinced I'd collapse before we even hit the mile mark. But Ben was patient, matching my pace, encouraging me with gentle words and an occasional joke to distract me from the ache. By the end of that first run, I was exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time, the goal felt within reach, and it wasn't just about running anymore, it was about proving to myself that I could do hard things. Training became a ritual, something I looked forward to despite the early mornings and sore muscles. Ben and I ran side by side through parks and trails, rain or shine, and with each run I felt stronger. The kids even got involved, cheering me on from the sidelines or biking alongside us as we ran. It became a family affair, a shared experience that brought us closer together. The day of the race arrived sooner than I expected. Standing at the starting line, surrounded by a sea of runners, I felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. Ben stood beside me, his hand briefly squeezing mine before the starting gun fired. The first few miles flew by in a blur of adrenaline and determination. Somewhere around mile 8, fatigue set in, and I began to doubt myself. My legs felt like lead, and the finish line seemed impossibly far away. But then I heard Ben's voice beside me, steady and reassuring. "You've got this, Emily. One step at a time." Those words carried me through the final stretch, and when I crossed the finish line, a wave of emotion crashed over me. I had done it. I had pushed through the pain, the doubt, the fear, and accomplished something I never thought possible. The kids were waiting for me at the end, holding handmade signs that read, "Go Mom," and "You're our hero." Tears streamed down my face as I hugged them, the pride in their eyes making every grueling mile worth it. Later that evening, as we sat around the table eating a celebratory dinner, I realized something profound. It wasn't just about the race. It was about everything that had led me to that moment, the heartbreak, the healing, the rediscovery of who I was and who I could become. That medal hanging around my neck was more than a token of the race. It was a symbol of my resilience, a reminder that I was capable of so much more than I'd ever given myself credit for. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt and fear. But those moments no longer defined me. Instead, they became stepping stones, opportunities to grow and learn. I continued painting, my work evolving as I did. Galleries began reaching out to me, inviting me to showcase my pieces in exhibitions that brought a new sense of purpose and fulfillment. I wasn't just creating art. I was telling a story, my story, through every brushstroke. Ben and I grew closer, our relationship deepening in ways I hadn't anticipated but welcomed wholeheartedly. He never tried to fix me or rush me. He simply stood by my side, supporting me as I navigated my own path. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, he took my hand and said, "You've taught me so much about what it means to start over. I can't wait to see what's next for us." His words filled me with a quiet certainty. For so long I had been afraid of what the future might hold, afraid to let myself hope. But now I felt ready. Ready to embrace whatever came next, to face the unknown with courage and an open heart. Months later, we decided to tackle another item from the list, the trip to Paris. It felt like a bold move, taking the kids on such an adventure, but it was exactly what we needed. Walking along the cobblestone streets, exploring museums, and eating croissants by the Seine felt like stepping into a dream. Watching the kids marvel at the Eiffel Tower, their laughter echoing through the bustling streets, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. This wasn't just a trip. It was a celebration of everything we had overcome, a reminder that life could be beautiful again. When we returned home, I started a new painting, inspired by the vibrant colors and energy of Paris. As I worked, I thought about that list, about how far I had come since the day I wrote it down. Each goal, each step forward had brought me closer to the life I wanted, the life I deserved. And while there was still so much more to explore, so many dreams yet to chase, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer defined by my past. I was defined by the strength it had taken to move beyond it. As I put the finishing touches on the painting, Ben walked into the studio, carrying a cup of tea and wearing that familiar, easy smile. He didn't say anything, just stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders as we looked at the canvas together. It was a riot of color, bold and unapologetic, just like the life I had built. And for the first time in years I felt whole. As life continued to unfold, it surprised me how natural the new normal began to feel. What had once seemed impossible, letting go of the past, rebuilding from the rubble of my marriage, had become a reality. The days no longer felt heavy with what-ifs or regrets. Instead, they were full of small, meaningful moments that added up to something far greater than I could have imagined. The kids were thriving in their routines, and our little household felt like a team. We tackled everything together, from chaotic school mornings to lazy Sunday afternoons. They laughed more, smiled more, and their happiness became the anchor that kept me steady. Every so often they would ask about the old days, memories of vacations or family dinners when Andrew was still part of our lives. I answered their questions honestly, never painting him as a villain but also not sugarcoating what had happened. They deserved the truth, even in its complexity, and I found that their resilience often left me in awe. Ben became an increasingly important part of that team. He didn't try to take over or impose himself on our lives, but he was there, steady and reliable in a way that felt like a balm to my soul. He helped the kids with their school projects, cheered them on at their soccer games, and somehow managed to make them feel seen and valued without ever overstepping his place in their world. It was clear they adored him, and I couldn't help but feel my heart swell every time I saw the way they lit up around him. For me, Ben was more than a partner. He was a mirror reflecting back the strength I sometimes forgot I had. On days when doubts crept in, when I questioned whether I was doing enough, being enough, he was there to remind me of everything I had already accomplished. He never let me diminish my own progress or fall into the trap of self-doubt, and in return, I tried to offer him the same support. His life hadn't been without its challenges, and together, we created a space where we could both heal and grow. One evening, as we sat on the couch after the kids had gone to bed, Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me with a small smile, and I immediately recognized it. It was my list. My heart skipped as I unfolded it, seeing the familiar bullet points, some of them now crossed off. Learn to paint.
Take solo trip.
Join a book club. Run a half marathon. Visit Paris. Each one marked a milestone, a moment where I had dared to step outside my comfort zone and reclaim my life. But at the bottom of the list, something new had been added, written in Ben's familiar handwriting. Said, "Build a future." I looked up at him, my throat tightening with emotion. "Build a future," I repeated softly, my voice trembling. "What does that mean?" He smiled, his eyes warm and steady as he reached for my hand. "It means whatever you want it to mean. Together, apart, however it feels right to you. I just wanted you to know that I see a future with you, Emily. And I'm willing to build it however you want. Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't the tears of heartbreak I'd grown so accustomed to in the past. These were tears of gratitude, of hope, of a cautious but undeniable joy that I hadn't let myself fully feel in years. I didn't respond right away, instead letting the weight of his words settle over me. For so long I had been afraid to look too far ahead, afraid to trust that happiness could last. But in that moment I realized that I was ready to take that leap, to believe in something bigger than myself. Let's build it, I said finally, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my cheeks. Let's build it together. From that night on, life took on a new kind of sweetness. Ben and I didn't rush into anything, but the intention was there, the shared commitment to creating something lasting. We started making plans, not just for ourselves but for the kids, for the life we wanted to create as a blended family. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the past tried to creep in and cast shadows over our future. But we faced those moments together, and each time we emerged stronger. My art continued to grow, not just as a passion but as a career. Galleries began reaching out to me with opportunities one never would have dreamed of when I first picked up a paintbrush. I even started teaching a weekly art class at the local community center, sharing what I had learned with others who were searching for their own creative outlets. It was humbling and rewarding to see people discover the same sense of freedom and expression that had helped me heal. The kids too began to find their own paths. My daughter, inspired by my paintings, started experimenting with her own art projects, covering the fridge with her colorful creations. My son discovered a love for science, spending hours tinkering with experiments and proudly explaining his discoveries to anyone who would listen. Watching them grow into themselves, seeing their passions take root, filled me with a sense of pride that was impossible to put into words. And then, one summer evening, something happened that solidified everything we had been building. Ben and I had taken the kids to a nearby lake for a weekend getaway, a chance to unplug and spend time together without distractions. As the sun set over the water, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ben knelt down on the sandy shore and pulled out a small velvet box. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't want to rush you or pressure you, but I know what I want. I want this. I want us. I want to spend my life building this future with you, with the kids, with everything we've created together. Will you marry me?" The world seemed to stop in that moment. I looked at him, then at the kids who were grinning and nodding like they had been in on the plan all along. My heart swelled with a mix of joy, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of peace. I knew my answer before the words even formed. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and sure. "Yes, I will." The cheers from the kids echoed across the lake as Ben slipped the ring onto my finger. It wasn't just a proposal. It was a promise, a declaration that the life we had built together was worth fighting for, worth celebrating, worth continuing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was truly deeply living. And this, I knew, was only the beginning. The days after the proposal felt surreal, like stepping into a dream that I was afraid might vanish if I held it too tightly. The kids were over the moon, buzzing with excitement as they began imagining what the wedding might look like. My daughter immediately declared herself in charge of picking the flowers, while my son proudly volunteered to design the invitations with his newly acquired skills in an online graphic design program. Watching them dive headfirst into the planning reminded me how far we had come, not just as individuals but as a family. They had embraced Ben as if he had always been part of our lives, and the way he treated them with patience, care, and respect only solidified my belief that this was the right path for all of us. Ben and I agreed to keep the wedding simple. Neither of us wanted anything extravagant, and our focus was on creating a celebration that felt intimate and genuine. We chose a small venue nestled in a meadow surrounded by tall oak trees, a place that felt timeless and full of quiet beauty. As we walked the grounds together, imagining how it would look on the day of the ceremony, I couldn't help but feel a swell of gratitude. This wasn't just a wedding venue, it was a symbol of the life we were building, a life rooted in simplicity, honesty, and love. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, life seemed to move in fast forward. Between work, the kids, and the never-ending list of tasks involved in planning even a small ceremony, I often found myself collapsing into bed at the end of the day, utterly exhausted but undeniably happy. Ben was my constant support, taking on tasks without hesitation, and somehow managing to make the process feel less like a chore and more like an adventure. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of seating charts and catering menus, he reached across the table and took my hand. "You know," he said with a grin, "if all this planning is stressing you out, we could just elope." I laughed, shaking my head. "Don't tempt me. The kids would never forgive us if we didn't let them be part of it." He nodded, his smile softening. "You're right. It's not just about us, it's about all of us. That's what makes this so special." His words stayed with me as the big day approached. This wasn't just a marriage between two people. It was the merging of two lives, two histories, two families into something entirely new. That thought gave me a sense of peace, even as the inevitable pre-wedding jitters crept in. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect day that felt like it had been crafted just for us. I woke early, the sunlight streaming through the windows as a quiet excitement settled over me. My daughter burst into the room shortly after, clutching the flower arrangement she had carefully selected, her face alight with pride. "Do you love them, Mom?" she asked, holding up a bouquet of wildflowers tied with a simple ribbon. "They're perfect," I said, pulling her into a hug. And they were. Just like everything about this day felt perfect. Not because it was extravagant or meticulously planned, but because it was ours. Getting ready was a blur of activity. My closest friends gathered around me, helping me into the simple lace dress I had chosen, while my daughter insisted on doing my hair despite her limited experience. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful because it came from her. When I finally looked in the mirror, I hardly recognized myself. Not because of the dress or the makeup, but because of the expression on my face, one of pure joy, untainted by fear or doubt. When the time came, I stood at the edge of the meadow, the soft hum of music drifting through the air as the guests took their seats. My son walked beside me, holding my hand tightly as if to steady both of us. "You look really pretty, Mom," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "Ben's going to be so happy." I blinked back, tears squeezing his hand. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means so much to me." As I began walking down the makeshift aisle, my eyes locked on Ben. He stood beneath an arch of wildflowers, his expression a mixture of awe and love that took my breath away. In that moment, everything else faded. The guests, the music, even the nervous flutter in my chest. All I could see was him, the man who had come into my life when I least expected it and shown me that it was possible to love and be loved again. The ceremony was simple, just as we had planned. We exchanged vows that we had written ourselves, words that were deeply personal and filled with the quiet, steady promise of a future built on trust and partnership. When Ben slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if every jagged piece of my life had finally clicked into place. When it was my turn, my hands trembled slightly as I slid the ring onto his finger, but my voice was steady as I said the words I had written. "I once thought my life was over. I thought I'd never find my way back to happiness, to hope. But then you came into my life not to fix me, but to show me that I was already whole. You've been my partner, my anchor, and my greatest joy. I promise to stand beside you to face whatever comes our way with courage and love, because with you I've found a home." The applause that followed felt like a distant hum, drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat. When Ben kissed me, the world seemed to tilt and right itself all at once. This was it. This was the life I had fought so hard to rebuild, and now it was finally mine. The rest of the day passed in a blur of laughter, dancing, and moments that I knew I would carry with me forever. The kids gave speeches that had everyone in tears, their words a testament to the family we had become. As the sun set and the meadow was bathed in golden light, Ben and I shared a quiet moment away from the crowd, sitting together on the edge of a small hill overlooking the venue. "This is it," he said, his voice soft as he laced his fingers through mine. "Our beginning." I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching as the stars began to appear in the deepening sky. "It's more than I ever dreamed of," I whispered. "And it's just the start." And as we sat there, surrounded by the love of our friends and family, I knew that no matter what the future held, we would face it together. The list that had once felt like a lifeline now felt like a celebration of everything I had become. And with Ben by my side, I was ready to keep building, to keep dreaming, to keep living the life I had fought so hard to create. This was my happily ever after. Not perfect, Not without challenges but real and full of love. And that was more than enough. As the stars scattered across the velvet sky that evening, I felt the kind of peace I had once believed was unattainable. Sitting beside Ben, hearing the distant laughter of our friends and family still celebrating, I realized the journey that had brought me here wasn't just about finding love again. It was about finding myself. Every pain, every doubt, every step forward and stumble backward had led to this moment, where I could look at my life and feel nothing but gratitude. The weeks after the wedding were a seamless blend of new routines and familiar comforts. Ben moved in officially, and while merging our lives took some adjusting, it felt right. The kids had their moments of adapting too, but their bond with Ben only grew stronger. One night, my son approached me while I was folding laundry. He fidgeted for a moment before blurting out, "It's okay if I call Ben Dad, right?" I paused, caught off guard by the emotion in his voice. Kneeling to meet his eyes, I said, "Of course it is, sweetheart. You can call him whatever feels right to you." That moment stayed with me. It wasn't about replacing Andrew. He still had a place in their lives, but about expanding what family meant. Ben wasn't just my partner. He had become a father figure, someone they could rely on and look up to. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. Life moved forward, not in dramatic leaps but in small, meaningful steps. My art continued to flourish, and I even opened a small studio in town where I could work and occasionally teach classes. The kids found their own passions too, from my daughter's growing love of photography to my son's endless experiments with robotics. Our home became a hive of creativity, laughter, and occasional chaos, but it was ours and it was beautiful. One evening, as Ben and I sat in the backyard watching fireflies dance in the twilight, he reached for my hand. "You ever think about what's next?" he asked. I smiled, squeezing his hand. "All the time, but I try not to plan too much anymore. Life has a way of surprising us." He laughed softly, nodding. "It does. But whatever comes next, I'm glad I get to face it with you." And that was the truth. There would be challenges, of course, life is never without them. But I had learned something invaluable through everything I had been through. I was strong enough to weather any storm, and with Ben by my side, I wouldn't have to face them alone. As the fireflies flickered around us, I leaned my head against his shoulder and closed my eyes. The future stretched out before me, full of unknowns, but for the first time in years it didn't feel daunting. Felt like an invitation. To grow, to love, to live fully and unapologetically. And that was exactly what I intended to do. This was my life, imperfect, messy, and gloriously real. And it was everything I could have hoped for.